I knew people died in mountains long before I had my accident. I sort of understood you were playing a game for very high stakes, and you might not actually have a choice over your fate. You like to think you control the odds by your judgment and by your skill, and it's not exactly true.
The climber, Joe Simpson, was 25 when he had an accident that nearly killed him. He wrote a book, Touching the Void, about his extraordinary battle to survive. Now he is going back to the mountain that first inspired him to climb, to tell a story that has haunted him since he was a boy. It is the tale of a great adventure that, just like his, turned into a terrifying test of endurance.
When I was 14, I read a story that stayed with me for the rest of my life. It was the story of Tony Kurtz. It says so many things about friendship, courage, and the strength of the human spirit. It inspired me to climb. In many ways, it's my story. We thought it was worth risking everything. I mean, we did. I've spent my life climbing mountains. Climbed difficult mountains, climbed easy mountains. I've climbed all over the world. But my dream was always to climb the Eiger.
Of all the summits in the Alps, the Eiger is the mountain that is a legend among climbers. It has fascinated Joe Simpson for as long as he can remember.
It is not the greatest mountain in the world. It is not the most beautiful mountain in the world. And the climbing on it is not the hardest. But to me anyway, and I think to many others of our generation, it's a seminal mountain. And it has a sort of hypnotic power about it. It has an atmosphere, something truly intimidating. This brooding presence. The first time you see it, you just look up, and you just think, good God.
From the east, west, and south, the Eiger looks like any other mountain. It is its north face that makes it a legend. A 6,000-foot vertical wall of rock and ice, it is a place that never gets the sun. And standing exposed to every storm sweeping into the Alps, it is a mountain where the weather can change with breathtaking speed.
I've seen it happen. I've seen the face turn into a maelstrom of rockfall and avalanches, the like of which I've never witnessed on any mountain in my life. There's something else extraordinary about it that almost heightens the sense of danger. You are so close to luxurious hotels, to people having fun. You can hear the excited chatter of tourists getting on and off the trains and drinking their beers. You can see them, and they can see you.
More than 60 men have died on the north face of the Eiger. It has killed some of the best young climbers of their generation and forced some of the most dramatic mountain rescues in the Alps. And it was this bleak history that caught Joe's imagination as a boy.
My father gave me a book called The White Spider. It was fascinating and it was frightening. And it was those stories, and one story in particular, the story of Tony Kurtz, that made me want to climb. There's a picture of Kurtz sitting in a meadow in the summer of 1936. This smiling young man looking at you from the past, and he was just a vibrant, energetic, ambitious young climber. It was just absolute excitement. It's what he lived for.
But this is not just a story that inspired Joe to climb. 11 years after reading of what happened to Kurtz on the Eiger, Joe had a climbing accident in Peru that nearly killed him. And what has haunted him ever since is that in strange and disturbing ways, his accident echoed the story of his childhood hero.
Kurtz was always there. Kurtz was always this figure. But what happened to me in Peru led me back to him.
Tony Kurtz set out to climb the north face of the Eiger on the 20th of July 1936. He and his fellow climbers were only the second team in its history to attempt it. Kurtz was 23, a newly qualified mountain guide from Bavaria. He was climbing with his friend and fellow guide, a brilliant young rock climber called Andreas Hinterstoisser. They had joined up on the climb with two Austrians. 27-year-old Willy Angerer was the eldest. His partner, Eddie Rainier, was the most experienced, a highly talented route finder and mountaineer. Their progress up the north face that day had turned into a public event. They were being watched from the valley below by a cluster of reporters and tourists. One by one, in the early 1930s, the great north faces of the Alps had been claimed, but the Eiger was still unconquered. It was so difficult, so dangerous, that one climber called it an obsession for the mentally deranged.
As you approach the bottom part of the face, you climb a series of shattered rock walls and rubble-strewn ledges. Then you get under the rope flue. It's a tiny feature on this face, and yet it's 1,000 feet high, an overhanging wall of rock. Then round the corner to the edge of the first ice field. The second ice field is this great swathe of ice, 1,800 feet wide. It's steep, it's getting steeper, and every time from now on that you get onto rock, it's getting steeper and steeper, until you get right to the base of the great ice chute called the White Spider. If you fell at this point, you would zip out into space. You probably wouldn't touch anything for 5,000 feet.
It was the scale of this vertical rock face that defeated the first climbers to attempt it. Karl Meringer and Max Sedlmayr set off in the summer of the previous year. 3 days into their climb, a storm hit the face. The men were seen trying to climb up and out to safety, but on the 5th day, they disappeared. Sedlmayr's body was found frozen into the ice at a place now called Death Bivouac. It was a very controversial tragedy. Climbers had died on many mountains in the Alps, but not in full view of the public. The North Face was called a suicidal challenge. There was talk of banning it to climbers. But the following summer, Kurtz and his friends arrived, ambitious young climbers chasing a great first ascent.
Noch 3 Meter, Eddie!
They wanted to do it for the same reason that we did, to see if it was possible. You don't feel like you ever have to justify yourself to anybody else. You go and do these things, and if other people think you're stupid or irresponsible, you don't give a damn.
Ganz kommen, Tony!
And I suppose as a young boy, I just thought, God, what an extraordinary thing to do. What, you know, not just a brave thing to do, an extraordinary thing to do. To look at a face like that and just think, I'm good enough. You know, I will climb this, I will succeed.
Eddie, come back!
But there was a reason people said the North Face was impossible. Confidence and optimism do not protect you on this mountain. And what happened to these 4 young climbers over the next 5 days proved beyond doubt that the Eiger was every bit as frightening as its reputation suggested.
Can I speak to Dad?
Yes, please.
risk of an unexpected avalanche is always present in the Alps. Unstable ice and snow and the threat of sudden storms are what make these mountains dangerous. Joe has been waiting for days for a weather window to climb on the Eiger. Local mountain guides advised that heavy snowfall and the unpredictable weather made it too great a risk for him and his climbing partner, Cubby. The Eiger is a mountain Joe has dreamt of climbing all his life. But bad luck and bad injuries have intervened each time.
This mountain, it's quite addictive.
Well, the powder will blow off.
I've made 6 attempts on the face and got bad weather every single time. But it calls you. I sort of had this phrase, the beckoning silence of great height, and what I was meaning by that was this: when you stand on the edge of a great drop, it's very difficult not to be absolutely staggered by it. When you look at a face like that and you're a mountaineer, you just want to go up there and play games on it.
Joe is here to retrace key sections of the route that Tony Kurtz and his friends took up the North Face in the summer of 1936. He will do the climb in stages, and for the first, he has an easy shortcut to a point a third of the way up the face. Because the Eiger has one other unusual feature. In the late 19th century, the Swiss government built a railway tunnel right up the middle of the mountain. Halfway up the track, a small access window was drilled through the mountain wall. It opens directly onto the north face of the Eiger.
There's such psychological baggage that it brings with it, this face. All the stories that you've heard, all the possible ways you could get hurt or trapped or killed. And you can't get those out of your head. It's quite a sort of surreal sensation starting a climb like this. I mean, it's not often that you come up a nice warm train and then just suddenly step out of a tunnel and you're just 1,500 feet up the north face of the Eiger. When you're suddenly exposed to an abyss like that, it's impossible not to be aware of the drop, the sense of the fall line below you. And it's quite a strange game it plays on you because, you know, this drop isn't actually doing you any harm at all. It's just there. But it gets in your head. About the same time I started reading the story of Tony Kurtz, I started rock climbing. It was just like, that's what I've been looking for. And I found that although it was a bit frightening, if you knew what you were doing, you could get rid of the fear. That was almost an addiction, really. It always had to have that mixture of apprehension and exhilaration, fear and excitement. And then you want to test yourself more and more. You want to go and do a first ascent, go and climb something at the extreme ability that you have. That's how you lived. And I didn't really realize how obsessive I became until many years later when my mother had died. I was given a bundle of postcards that I'd sent to her 20 years or so before, and I didn't recognize my former self. So it was this utterly driven person who was completely obsessed. There was nothing on the cards about anything other than mountains and grades and routes, which would have meant absolutely nothing to my parents. And it was all written in tiny letters all around a postcard. There was only a little square in the middle for the address. Perhaps you have to become a little obsessive to do something to that degree.
At a point a third of the way up the north face, the route of Tony Kurtz's ambitious attempt on the mountain brings Joe within sight of a place that is notorious amongst climbers. At first, Kurtz and his 3 friends made rapid progress up the face, climbing 1,500 feet on the morning of their first day. But then they were stopped in their tracks by a smooth slab of polished rock.
Tony.
The climbers had mapped out a new route, gambling that the fastest way up the face was to follow the path of the great ice fields at its center. Their plan was to aim for the left-hand corner of the vast rock wall, the rotorflue, and sneak across to the bottom of the first ice field. But it was at this critical point that the rock barrier blocked their path.
This section here, it's only about 15 feet maximum. It's incredibly smooth. You can just see by all the crampon scratches all over it. People have had trouble here. There's quite a wake-up drop below us, mine. Probably about 2,000 feet straight down. And up here, there's a very old peg. I reckon what Hinterstoicer did is he climbed up these ledges, put that peg in and clipped his rope in it.
Okay.
With the advantage of the rope above him, he could sort of do a downward traverse across these very smooth slabs, being given tension by his companions.
Okay. Oh, that's it.
Hinterstoicer knew he was the best rock climber there. He was the only one who could do this. But if he falls off, he's going to take a huge swing and be hanging underneath.
Edging sideways in a step-by-step traverse across this near-vertical rock is still so difficult and dangerous that climbers today always leave a fixed rope in place. But Hinterstoicer was climbing rock no one had touched before, and he was climbing into the unknown. He had no way of telling what lay out of sight around the corner. It was a virtuoso piece of climbing. Crossing this 100-foot stretch of rock had unlocked the heart of the face. With the security of the rope in place, his friends could cross one by one. And all of them knew it was possible that nothing as difficult as this lay between them and the summit.
Hey, super! Wow! Woohoo! Billy, come!
They set off on a great adventure. They believed in themselves, and they proved through their own brilliance they were capable of doing this.
Gut gemacht. Super.
That's what I loved about climbing. It's about having fun. It's about living to the full. I look at Kurtz, and it's almost like seeing back to when you were 20 years old. We thought it was worth risking everything, all of the rest of your life, every happiness you ever could have had, and all the experiences you have in all the countries and on all the mountains. They change who you are. and they mould who you are, and it becomes something that's life-enhancing and life-defining.
The dream of a first ascent on the North Face was now in sight. But in their elation that morning, there was one thing the four climbers didn't know. Without a rope fixed in place, it is impossible to climb back across the traverse.
What they were thinking about was the way ahead. They intended to climb to the summit. As they pulled the rope back, it didn't for one moment enter their minds that they might have to try and come back this way.
3,000 feet up the north face of the Eiger, the terrain changes. A massive ice field extends across the width of the rock face at the halfway point of the climb. And with it comes a new danger. Because beyond the sheer scale of the face and the potential to get trapped by bad weather, there's another menace always present on this mountain. In late afternoon, when the sun hits the edge of the face, the ice begins to melt. Thousands of loose rocks, frozen into the ice field over the years, start to work loose. And when they fall, they come down with incredible speed.
Achtung, Steine!
You look up. Thrum, thrum, thrum. Bzz, 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 bzz. Something the size of half a brick. It's fallen 500 feet through the air, shooting past you. It hits with extraordinary velocity. It won't just break your arm. It'll shatter the bone.
Steine! Even noch!
The climbers had no helmets, just simple felt hats.
Schneller! Hey! Tony, komm!
But one by one that afternoon, Tony Kurtz and his friends took their turn to make the 300-foot dash up the first ice field.
Tony! Stein! 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 Oh!
Willie Angerer was the third to go.
There was just a volley of stones that just came all round them, and none of them were hit, and then Angerer was hit. In that one instance, in that sickening sound of somebody being smashed on the head by a stone, everything would have been suspended for a second. It only takes one slip, one false move, one single stone to come out of nowhere, and it becomes a completely different game that you're playing.
The climbers were more than halfway to the summit of the Eiger. That morning, a great first ascent had seemed within their grasp. But now, Willie Angerer had some kind of head injury, and the four friends faced the hardest of choices, whether to push on to the top or turn back to safety. After the shock of Angerer's accident, the four climbers wrote themselves to a ledge on the Eiger and rested for the night. The next morning, witnesses saw them leave their camp at 7 a.m. Everyone expected them to start down, but instead, they began to climb again. They were halfway up a mountain no one had climbed before, and that was a prize they would not give up lightly. The men had reached the point where the 1,800-foot wide expanse of the second ice field stretches out across the north face. The ice field is 3,000 vertical feet above the valley. But the skills of the local air rescue team mean Joe can be dropped onto the ice field by helicopter. The pilot will fly close enough to the mountain to winch him down to a ledge that is barely 2 feet wide. From this point, Joe will be able to retrace Kurtz's progress on the second day of his climb.
They must have felt pretty good when they got here. All the main features of the face are now apparent. You can see the ramp up above the second ice field. They know from here they should have no problem getting to Sadelmeyer and Meiringer's high spot of the year before to Death Bivouac.
The second ice field is an exposed and dangerous place. Hinterstoisser and Kurtz knew it was ground they needed to cover as fast as possible. But as the morning wore on, it became clear they had a problem. The injured Willy Angera was getting slower by the hour.
Inside, they would have been thinking, get a move on, get a move on. And by the same degree, Angera would have known that he's not moving fast enough. It's like you're trying to get to the most important meeting in your life and you're stuck in a traffic jam in the worst possible place. I mean, they still had half the height of the face to go, 3,000 feet above them. That's vertical height. They probably had about 8,000 feet total distance to climb.
The four men would have expected to cross the second ice field in 5 or 6 hours. But by the end of the day, they were still making their slow traverse across it. That evening, they made another camp on the ice. Each of them knew the dangers of moving too slowly on this mountain, the risk of getting trapped by bad weather. It was what had killed the first 2 climbers to attempt it.
I can imagine what it must have felt like to be Kurtz or Hinterstoisser, the uninjured pair. I would have been thinking, this isn't going to work. You know, we cannot climb this at this speed. We probably have the hardest climbing ahead of us. And maybe in some whispered conversation with my partner, I'd say, look, do you think those 2 can get down on their own? Because we can go on as a pair. And I think Angera and Rainier couldn't fail to have been aware that things had changed. You have to add something else into this. This is where Sadelmeyer and Meiringer had died the year before. Sadelmeyer was frozen into the snow, probably less than a rope length from where they were sitting that night. You know, you like to think, as a young man, you control the odds by your judgment and by your skill. And that sort of gives you your sense of invulnerability. And it's not exactly true.
Joe was just 2 years older than Kurtz when something happened that changed his life. He was 25, climbing in Peru, when he broke his leg in a split-second fall. His climbing partner Simon tried to lower him down the mountain, but in the darkness, Joe slid over the edge of an ice cliff, and he was trapped, hanging in space above a precipice. To save himself, Simon was forced to cut the rope. Joe fell 150 feet into a crevasse. Then, for 4 days, he crawled to safety with a badly shattered leg.
When I got back to England, I had 6 operations on my knee. I was in plaster for 9 months. I was on crutches for 12 months. And as I was discharged, the consultant told me, you'll never walk without a limp. And you'll never climb again. I don't think he really understood what he was saying to me. Climbing was my whole life. It was a passion. I remember sitting on the bed, looking at my legs, or just crying, because this guy was telling me it was over. So I'd go down to the local swimming pool and just swim and swim. And eventually I got to a point where I was going 5 days a week, and I started getting fitter and fitter and fitter. It was a long, hard rehabilitation. But it was enough in the end to start climbing again. I should have been pretty much set up and happy, and I wasn't really. Something changed. Something inside had been damaged.
On the morning of July the 20th, 1936, witnesses in the valley saw something odd happen among the 4 climbers. As they left their camp on the ice, 2 of them pushed ahead, climbing fast towards the summit. It was Andreas Hinterstoiser and Tony Kurtz.
These 2 wanted to do the climb. They could actually see the path ahead to the summit. They know that Anger is injured, but they would have been hoping that if they just are bullish, aggressive, go for it, come on lads, do it, they'll come with them. And then they were stopped dead in their tracks. It would have become apparent as soon as they started climbing that Anger wasn't as well as they thought. God, the disappointment. Shit. Damn. We could have climbed it. We could have climbed it. Their dream had gone. And then everything changed. The task they had now was to save another man.
To retreat now meant reversing their tracks 1,800 feet across the second ice field, then 3,000 feet down to the safety of the valley below. But this time, they had an injured man who was clearly deteriorating. They began the descent at midday. It took them most of the afternoon to make their way back across the second ice field. To make matters worse, in the valley below were the first telltale signs of bad weather approaching.
Anderl! Was? Das Wetter kommt schlecht!
It was as if they were on a balance, of excitement and adventure and anticipation on one side, tipping in to losing control and failure. And it's at that point that everything tipped.
At 8:30 that night, the climbers stopped to rest. It was their third night on the north face, and they were back at the halfway point of the climb. The following day, their retreat would bring them to the 100-foot rock barrier, the Traverse.
Hinterstoicer, of all people, knew how difficult it had been to climb across the Traverse. He'd done it in dry conditions. And I'm sure it must have been going through his mind. We've got 3,000 feet to descend, but we've got one crux thing. First, we have to get back across the Traverse.
By the morning of the fourth day, the mountain was enveloped in cloud. The temperature was dropping, and water was beginning to pour down the face, freezing in places to the rock around them. The men left the bivouac around 7 a.m., but Angara's condition appeared to be worsening. Their descent of the first ice field that morning was painfully slow. The seriousness of their position would now have struck all of them. They couldn't climb up to safety, and they couldn't climb down. Below them was a 700-foot abyss. They knew if they couldn't get back across the Traverse, they were trapped. What they didn't know was what Hinterstoicer had done the first time wasn't possible in reverse.
This is about plumb centre of the Hinterstoicer. To come across, Hinterstoicer had put the high peg in and clipped his rope in it. And so he had his rope running down to him under tension, and he could have leant with his friends tensioning him across this blank bit, and then they pull their ropes back. To come back, he couldn't get any tension. He didn't have any high pitons above us. And you can just see this section here. 15, 20 feet, it's absolutely ice-worn smooth. There are downward facing ledges which are tricky enough in these conditions, but if this was ice glazed, it would have been absolutely desperate.
And it was. The glass-smooth rock of the Traverse was now wet
Wir müssen darüber.
and streaked with black ice.
Hältst du mich?
Ich kann ihn fast nicht mehr halten.
Everything would have compressed into this small moment of time.
Schafft's nicht.
Every fibre in his body would have been concentrating on every tiny move. This is their best climber, trying for all he was worth to get back across the very thing that he had so brilliantly unlocked.
Es ist alles nass. Scheiße.
Spent almost 5 hours trying to cross the Traverse.
I reckon virtually where I'm standing now is where Hinterstoicer would have repeatedly fallen off, desperately just trying to climb this section.
Wenn wir noch mit Atze. Es geht noch mit Atze.
There is that moment when activity stops.
Geht nicht. Es geht nicht.
You just know you can't do this. And you have to accept that it's over.
Komm zurück. Anderen.
Komm zurück.
Komm, probier.
And it would have gradually been dawning on all of them that this could be a fatal error, that they hadn't left a rope across.
Komm schon, komm.
They couldn't cross the traverse. It was unclimbable.
Geht nicht.
But if they stayed where they were going to die.
Es geht nicht. Wir kommen nicht zurück. Wir sind da runter.
The very piece of brilliance that had unlocked the heart of the face had trapped them. As a storm comes into the face, you can sense it as much as see it. There's this horrible sense of expectancy. The hair on the back of the head starts to rise, and you become incredibly aware that it's about to happen, And then all hell is let loose.
The storm hit the Eiger on the climber's 4th day on the north face. For the watchers in the valley, it was an unsettling reminder of the previous year. Just like the first 2 climbers to attempt it, Kurtz and the others had simply disappeared behind the cloud. Trapped halfway up the mountain, the climbers now knew they couldn't climb up to safety or back across the traverse. It would gradually have dawned on all of them that there was only one option left: to descend the vertical ground below them.
I imagine they don't even want to contemplate it. They were still 3,000 feet above the valley. They stay where they are, Angara will certainly die. But they're not going to survive in these conditions much longer. Another night on the face, exhausted, they're not going to last. Below them, they had ground dropping away steeply, ice-covered rocks getting steeper and steeper until eventually they knew there was a rock barrier some 200 feet high, vertical and overhanging. If they get out, and it's a big if, there is a ledge system that runs across the face.
This ledge system led to a small door drilled through the mountain wall into the railway tunnel. It was the same door that Joe used as a shortcut onto the face.
Everything that's been happening to them that day is limiting their options. They had a barely conscious man to try and bring down. And to make matters worse, their line of descent led them directly to the stones and the avalanches that were hurtling down from above. To step out into the face of those avalanches would have seemed suicidal. But there's no other choice.
This is pretty much their abseil line of descent. This really would have been an awful place to start trying to get down. I've got good visibility today, and I wouldn't like to be going down here. In the teeth of a storm, they wouldn't have been able to see very far at all. And they would have to contend with lowering somebody who was probably barely capable of looking after himself, going in and out of consciousness. Then you have to think of their gear. Hemp ropes frozen into wires, clothing that's been wet for the last 3-4 days, been cold, tired. It would have been a very serious situation indeed.
They heard this voice, and they just look at each other, and they know what it is.
A railway guard had gone down to the tunnel door they were trying to reach, and he was calling out to them in the storm.
And they just shouted back, all's well, which is classic when you think about it. absolutely no mention of the fact they've got a badly injured companion. No mention of how exhausted and how tired they are and the danger they're in. That's a sort of pride, really. They will come down together. They do not need help. But more than anything, their spirits would have just raised at that point. There was someone else there. You just have to do 4 abseils, possibly 5. We'll be having a cup of tea with the guard in 2 hours. It was over.
As Joe is filming on the Eiger, the weather window starts to close. A forecast comes through for heavy snow. The helicopter must take Joe off before the cloud cover descends. From the narrow ledge on the face, he will have to clip back onto the winch line that is just 5 millimeters thick. It is so thin because if the climber becomes entangled, the pilot will be forced to cut the line.
You walk right on the edge of things in the mountains. And there's a very fine line between success and disaster, between life and death. And walking on the edge of that gives you a completely different perspective on life and your sense of being alive. And even when you're climbing and the conditions are great and everything's going swimmingly, you always have that little part in the back of your mind that's just saying, just watch out, watch out, watch out. It can go wrong in an instant.
At 2 p.m. that afternoon, Andreas Hinterstoiser unclipped from the rope that linked the 4 climbers and began to prepare their final abseil. They were barely 200 feet from safety.
The violence of it, the shock of it, must have been immense. A massive avalanche just caught them like a tsunami. It just blasted Angra and Kurtz straight off the ledge and out into the abyss below. The impact of these two yanked Rainier up against the piton.
Hey! Willie! Willie!
Below Kurtz, Willie Angera was almost certainly dead,
Willie!
killed on impact with the rock face. And out of sight above him, Eddie Rainier was dying too.
Eddie!
The weight of the 2 climbers on the rope around his waist would have crushed his diaphragm and slowly asphyxiated him. It would have taken him 10 minutes to die. There was no sign of Andreas Hinterstoiser. His body was later discovered at the foot of the North Face, 2,000 feet below.
Kurtz was just hanging in space. His companion dead below him, and his companion dead above him. And Hinterstoiser is gone, swept out into the void. I've been in a situation where people have fallen to their deaths close by me. And it renders you almost incapable of doing anything. You're so threatened by the immediacy of the death. You're sort of unmanned. You're physically incapable of getting over the shock of what you've just witnessed.
At 3 o'clock that afternoon, the railway guard from the tunnel called down to the mountain guides in the valley. He said he'd gone out to call for the 4 young climbers again, but this time had heard only one voice calling back, crying desperately for help. Within an hour, a rescue party had travelled up the tunnel to the window that led directly onto the north face. They knew if they climbed the ledge system that ran across the face, it would place them somewhere below where Kurtz was trapped. 700 feet from the window, they reached a point where they could hear his cries. But Kurtz was out of sight, 150 feet above them. To reach him, they would have to climb a series of vertical and overhanging cliffs in what were now gale force winds.
Tony Kurtz keeps imploring them, you cannot get to me from below. You must climb up and you will be able to abseil down to me. But they can't do it. They can't do it in those conditions. And it's getting on to darkness. They can't afford to be pinned out in the open in this storm. They will die too. And they say it to Tony, you have to hang on until the morning. You must hang on. It must have been heartbreaking for those guys to leave him there. They probably knew that he wasn't going to make the night. They could hear his cries coming back to them. This is a man who would never have asked for rescue in his life. And he was pleading almost childlike for them not to leave him. And I can remember feeling like that. I hung in a very long, dark night. And I can remember just almost being overwhelmed by the loneliness of the situation. The sense of being abandoned. And he'd have known as a guide that his chances of surviving that night would be slim to nil. Cold takes you in a particularly insidious way, as if it's creeping through you. Tentacles of cold are starting to creep through you, starting to slow everything down, to turn things off inside. And the thought of just sleeping is so seductive. It would have been so easy just to let it go. In truth, if my partner hadn't cut the rope, I would have died of cold. So I can imagine what he felt like hanging on that rope. You are helpless like that. And just incredibly alone. I knew people died in mountains long before I had my accident. I sort of understood you were playing a game for very high stakes, and you might not actually have a choice over your fate. But recovering from the accident in Peru, I wrote this book, Touching the Void. In the end, I wrote it in 7 weeks, and I thought if it sold 500 copies, then I would be happy. I discovered I had another talent. But the process of writing made me think too much about what we were doing, about the price some of us were paying for this. I started thinking about the people who died. Some were acquaintances and some were good friends and some were friends I never stopped thinking about. And some died in different ways and some died in inexplicable ways, and often when they died the first thing you did was you asked how, not why, because you wanted to know what they did wrong. We did something that we loved with a passion, you know, and it was life-enhancing and life-defining, and yet it was killing our friends and nearly killing us. And I suppose when I started writing, I opened a Pandora's box of fears that you can never quite put the lid on. Despite all the climbing I did, I knew that I was more exposed and more vulnerable. And I suddenly realized my love affair with risk-taking had cooled. I didn't want to play this game anymore.
A summer storm on the Eiger is often followed by a cold front. All the water that's been pouring down the face freezes. Ice fills every ledge, crack and foothold, and glazes every surface of the rock. During Kurtz's 4th night on the Eiger, its vertical face had frozen solid.
I just can't imagine how long that night must have been. What on earth Kurtz did to hold on to life. He'd lost his glove, and his exposed hand was now completely frostbitten. His arm was like a claw. And then he would have heard the clanking of metal and the shouts of the guides as they came back along the tracks they'd made the previous night. He must have thought, they're guides, they're just going to get me down, they're just going to get me down.
For the second time, the rescue team made it to within 150 feet of Kurtz, but the vertical cliffs above them were now sheathed in millimetre-thick black ice. The rescuers reported that climbing up was impossible. Somehow, they had to find a way to get Kurtz down. But the rope he was hanging on wasn't long enough to reach them. So first, Kurtz had to free himself, and then he had to find more rope.
They said to Tony, the only way you can do that is cut Angara free. Angara is hanging below him, frozen to the rock wall. And he's faced with this awful predicament. He has to get his knife and hack away at the frozen fibers of the rope. This is a man he's just spent the last 4 days living with in great intensity. He's just going to cut him free.
But cutting away Willie Angara was just the start. To make enough rope to reach the rescuers, Kurtz had to climb up and cut away Eddie Rainier too. In the valley, the drama unfolding on the north face was drawing a crowd. For hour after hour that day, they waited for glimpses of Kurtz between the clouds. It was mid-morning by the time he started his slow and painful progress up the rope.
He had to get up about 5-10 feet, and he got to a point where the rock steepened. And then he could hand over hand up the rope, using his feet on the rock, get himself up to Rainier.
Hey, Eddie! Eddie!
Kurtz needed 150 feet of rope to reach the rescuers. But even when he'd cut Eddie free, he didn't have enough. The only way to make more was to unravel the frozen 3-ply rope with his frostbitten hands.
I just think about what it was like. Just all night, stay awake, don't let the cold take you. They'll come for me in the morning. And when they come for you in the morning, there's yet another impossible task set to you. And then another one, and another one. That, in a way, haunts me. It wasn't just luck that I survived. I made an effort. Because all I had to do once I found a way out is endure. It wasn't easy, but that's all I had to do. So I know what strength of mind it takes to just keep death away.
It took Kurtz 5 hours to unravel the rope and knot the pieces together. But when he finished, he had a single strand that at last linked him to the rescuers, just 150 feet below him.
Now, he couldn't abseil on this rope because it was only a single strand. It wasn't strong enough. But he could pull a rope up. And the guides attached pitons and a climbing rope.
Donny! Aufziehen!
But as Kurtz began to pull up the rope, the rescuers realized it wasn't long enough.
Donny! Donny, stop!
So they got another, and then they joined the two ropes with a knot.
Donny! Aufziehen!
And they watched this bunch of pitons and the rope gradually going up, painfully slow. All he now had to do, was abseil down to safety.
From the beginning.
On the afternoon of his 5th day on the Eiger, Tony Kurtz began his descent towards the rescue team. He had 150 feet of broken ground and one vertical and overhanging cliff to abseil. If the rescuers had calculated right, the two climbing ropes they had knotted together would be just enough to bring the weak and exhausted climber down.
This is the painfully slow, inch by inch, jerking down movement of a man who is at the absolute limit of his physical strength. His hands were frostbitten, and he did what any sensible person would do. He got the abseil rope and he clipped it through this carabiner, through a snap link at his waist, because he knew with his frozen hands and his frozen arm he would have very little control. And the guides are now looking up. They see his legs appearing over the overhang, They are going to get him. He was almost within reaching distance. But as he starts to come down, he sees the knot joining the two ropes. It's about 50 feet off the ground. And as Kurtz inches down towards safety, he feels below him the knot tight against his fist. And he knows instantly what the problem is. The knot is jammed against the snap-link. And he's now just swinging in space, out of reach of the guides, off to the side from them, off to the left. They had traversed as far around as they could reach, and then the face dropped away below him. If he'd managed to abseil down to a point that was level, they could have thrown a rope to him, pulled him across. While he was above them, they could do nothing for him. Couldn't throw a rope to him, they couldn't pull him down to them, there was nothing they could do. And he knows if he can't get this knot through the snap link, he's finished. And the guides there, helplessly screaming encouragement to him, you can do it, come on, just one more effort. They could hear him mumbling unintelligibly to himself, trying to exhort himself of one last effort to force this knot through. And it wouldn't go. Suddenly, he sat forward. He stopped fighting the knot. And he said in a clear, strong voice,
Ich kann nicht mehr.
I'm finished. I suppose I look at Tony Kurtz and the manner of his death, and I know that that should have been me, that his story should have been mine. In truth, I should have died on a rope in Peru. And that will never be explainable to me, why I was allowed to live and he wasn't.
The rescuers who watched Kurtz die were never able to reach his body. He was finally cut free by a team of mountain guides from Germany, who arrived just too late to help in the rescue. 3 days after his death, the Swiss authorities banned all climbers from the North Face. But 4 months later, after a legal challenge, the ban was lifted. For ambitious young climbers, another public tragedy had only added to the legend of the Eiger. Tony Kurtz and his fellow climbers, Eddie Rainier and Willy Angerer, had watched as Andreas Hinterstoiser unlocked the heart of the North Face. In honor of his brilliant climb, it was called the Hinterstoiser Traverse. And using that route, a team of German climbers made the first descent 2 years later in 1938. In all, 8 climbers died trying before the last great north face of the Alps was conquered. Of all of them, Tony Kurtz proved the hardest to forget. As Joe prepared to head home, he made one last climb to look across to the mountain where he died.
I read the story of Tony Kurtz at 14. It stuck with me for the rest of my life. That to me just seems the most dreadful way to die. And yet somehow it inspired me. Why on earth would that inspire you to climb? Well, because he never gave up. Right to the end, he thought he could win through. He displayed to me something quite extraordinary about the human spirit. The ability to just, despite anything that's happening to you, to just keep on going. And he deserved to survive. He deserved to live. The photograph I always remember is of the young, smiling, tousle-haired guide laughing at the camera with the adventure of the climb ahead of him. And I thought, he thought that was worth living for. I better go and try and see if I can do that. If you were going to risk all that, not just risk the hardship and the pain, but risk your life. Put everything on the line for a dream, for something that's worth nothing, that can't be proved to anybody. You just have the transient moment on a summit. When you come back down to the valley, it goes. It is actually a completely illogical thing to do. It's not justifiable by any rational terms. That's probably why you do it. My dream was to climb the Eiger, and it just never turned out like that. I haven't climbed for 3 years. I lost the passion to do it. I don't have that sort of immortality of youth, that it'll never happen to me, self-confidence. It's an awareness of frailty I never had when I was 20. But I'm not saying never, because I know what I'm like. And coming back here to do this, the face was in perfect condition and the meadows were like the summer. I just felt that old rush coming back. Oh God, you idiot.
Beckoning Silence is available soon on DVD and includes exclusive unseen extras. To pre-order your copy, visit channel4.com/shop. Next up, new comedy on 4 with Russell Brand's Ponderland, pondering his childhood.